bucka, 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 bucka. Ha You know the deal.
Our next unit in number sense is going to be on fractions. Before we talk about fractions, there's a couple of important concepts we need to talk about, and those are called greatest common factor and lowest common multiple. So the first question we'd ask ourselves is, what is a factor? Well, a factor is a whole number that divides evenly into another whole number. So, for example, if you take a number like 12, well, we would say that 6 is a factor of 12. And the reason that 6 is a factor of 12 is because 12 divided by 6 is 2. So, in other words, 6 divides evenly into 12 because we don't get a decimal for our answer when we divide 12 divided by 6. So 6 is a factor of 12. Now, oftentimes it's helpful to list all the factors of a number. So if we take the number 12 again, sometimes when you're coming up with factors, it's helpful to come up with all the multiplication questions that would equal 12. So I usually start with the smallest value that goes evenly into 12, which is 1. Well, 1 times 12 is 12. And then the next smallest value that goes evenly into 12 is 2. And 2 times 6 is 12. And then the next smallest value that goes evenly into 12 is 3. And 3 times 4 is 12. Now the next smallest value is 4, but we already have 4 as a value here. So what we now have here is essentially a list of all of the factors of 12. And it can also be helpful to write the list from smallest to biggest. So all of the factors of 12 from smallest to biggest are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. Now the reason it can be helpful is because when you write them from smallest to biggest like this, if you start on either end with the smallest and the biggest, 1 times 12 is 12, 2 times 6 is 12, and 3 times 4 is 12. If you happen to miss one, you'll be missing one of the numbers that you're multiplying by. And again, so writing them from smallest to biggest like this can help you make sure that you don't miss any. It doesn't guarantee that you won't miss any, but it helps ensure that you probably won't miss any. When we're dealing with fractions, we're usually looking for what's called the greatest common factor of 2 or more numbers. So we're going to take a look at 12 and 18, and what we're going to do is list all of the factors of each. So we've already done this for 12. We know all the factors of 12 are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. Well, when I'm listing all of the factors for 18, I'm going to start with the multiplication questions that equal 18. So I'll start with 1. 1 times 18 is 18. 2 goes evenly into 18 because 2 times 9 is 18. 3 goes in evenly, so we've got 3 times 6. Now 4 does not go into 18, and 5 does not go into 18. And 6 does, but we already have 6 on our list here. So when I take my multiplication questions here and write this in a list, I've got a list now of all of the factors. And if I do it from smallest to biggest, it's 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, and 18. Well, we can see that the factors of 12 and the factors of 18 have a few factors in common. 1, 2, 3, and 6 are all on both of these lists. And when we're looking for the greatest common factor, or the GCF, we're looking for the biggest value. That's the same in both lists. And here, the GCF, or greatest common factor, of 12 and 18 is 6. So again, greatest common factor is the biggest factor of 2 or more numbers. That's the same. So let's look at another example where we're looking for the greatest common factor. This time we're going to look at 8 and 15. So to come up with a list of factors for 8, I'll write all of the multiplication questions that equal 8. So we always start with 1. 1 is always going to be a factor of every number. We have 1 times 8, 2 times 4, and that's it. 3 doesn't go evenly into 8, and we already have 4 on our list. For 15, we've got 1 times 15, and 2 doesn't go evenly into 15, but 3 does, so we have 3 times 5. So again, if I'm going to list all of the factors by writing the multiplication questions like this, I've got a list of factors here, and it's all of those numbers. We can put them from smallest to biggest. And then if I do the same for 15, from smallest to biggest, we've got all our values there in the multiplication questions. So that's all of the factors. So if we look at these two lists here, there's actually only one common factor, and the only common factor we have here is 1. So the greatest common factor of these two values here is 1. So the next thing we're going to talk about is multiples, and the first question we're going to want to ask ourselves is, what is a multiple? Well, a multiple is a number you get by counting in another number. So for example, if we take 5, multiples of 5 are just the numbers we get by counting in 5s. So if we count in 5s, we get 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on. Now, unlike factors, with multiples, we can go on forever. Factors, there are a limited number of factors for every number. But multiples, there is no limit to the number of multiples that we have. If we took the multiples of 3 as another example, well, multiples of 3 are just counting in 3s. So we've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and so on, just counting in 3s. All of those numbers there are multiples of 3. So here we have multiples of 5 and multiples of 3. When we're looking for the lowest common multiple, we're looking for the first number that appears on both lists. And as we can see here, the first number that appears on both lists is 15. So the lowest common multiple, or the LCM of 5 and 3, is 15. So let's take a look at two other examples. Suppose we want to find the lowest common multiple of 6 and 8. Well, once again, when we're talking about multiples, we're talking about counting in these values. So if I count in 6s, we've got 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, and again, I'm just counting in 6s. That's how I'm coming up with these multiples of 6, 42, and 48. For multiples of 8, we've got 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48. And so on. Now for both of these lists, I could keep going. I could keep going forever. But we have to stop at some point, and this looks like a pretty good place to stop here. Now if I'm looking for the lowest common multiple, I'm looking for the first number that appears on both lists. As I can see, there's a couple of common multiples here on these lists. 24 appears on both, and 48 also appears on both. So 24 and 48 are both common multiples, but the lowest common multiple is the first one we see, the smallest one of all of those values. And the smallest one of the values that are the same on both lists is 24. Now it's interesting to note here that when we multiply 6 times 8, it does equal 48. If you're looking for any common multiple, you can always multiply the two numbers together. That will give you a common multiple, but not necessarily the lowest common multiple. So to finish off our lesson today, I'm going to get you to practice your understanding of greatest common factor and lowest common multiple by stating the greatest common factor and lowest common multiple for each pair of numbers. So for each question here, you'll have two answers. One is the greatest common factor, the biggest number that goes evenly into both numbers, And another answer is your lowest common multiple, the first number that appears on both lists of multiples of each number. If you're able to do that, congratulations, you now have a firm understanding of greatest common factor and lowest common